For decades, Sir Cliff Richard was the golden boy of British pop, a man whose voice defined generations. From the 1950s to the 1990s, he filled arenas, broke records, and built a legacy few could rival. But then, he vanished. No farewell tour, no goodbye interview, just silence.
I like it because I know one thing for certain is that if you do get married, you must commit yourself to that.
Fans began to wonder what really happened to the man who once stood shoulder to shoulder with Elvis. Why did the legend who gave us Living Doll, Congratulations, and Devil Woman disappear from the spotlight? Some whispered about burnout, others spoke of heartbreak, and for years the truth was buried beneath rumors and speculation. But behind the headlines was a story far more complicated. A story about faith, fame, and the price of being adored by millions, yet understood by none. Now, decades later, the truth has finally come to light. And it reveals not a scandal, but a soul seeking peace in a world that never let him rest. This is the untold story of Cliff Richard, the man who gave up the spotlight to find himself again.
Before he became Sir Cliff Richard, before the fame, the screaming fans, the gold records, there was just a shy boy named Harry Roger Webb, born in 1940 in Lucknow, India, during the final years of the British Empire. His father worked for the Indian Railways, his mother stayed home caring for the children, and their life, though modest, was happy. But in 1948, when India gained independence, the family's world collapsed overnight. They were forced to return to England with almost nothing, just a few suitcases and fading memories of the tropical sun. They settled in Hertfordshire, in a small council house, where young Harry learned what it meant to start over. Britain, still recovering from war, was gray and cold. For a boy who had grown up under Indian skies, it was a shock, but also the place where a dream began to form. Harry found escape in music. Late at night, he'd listen to the radio, mesmerized by the voice of Elvis Presley. Something about Elvis, his rhythm, his rebellion, his rawness, spoke to the boy who felt invisible. By 15, he had a guitar. By 17, he had a band, the Drifters, later renamed the Shadows. He changed his name to Cliff Richard. Cliff, because it sounded solid, like something you couldn't knock down, and Richard, after his idol, Little Richard. His rise was meteoric. Within a few short years, he went from playing youth clubs to selling out theaters. With songs like Move It, he became Britain's first true rock and roll star, young, dangerous, and magnetic. But beneath the swagger, Cliff remained Harry, the boy from a displaced family, raised to believe in duty, politeness, and faith. His mother, a devout Christian, kept him grounded, even as fame began to consume him. He once said, "She never let me forget who I was before all this." That tension between the rebel rock star the world adored and the humble boy who feared losing himself would define the rest of his life. And in time, it would also be the reason he'd walk away from the spotlight he once conquered.
By the early 1960s, Cliff Richard wasn't just a singer, he was a phenomenon. In a time when Britain was still recovering from the war, his voice carried hope, energy, and a taste of rebellion wrapped in innocence. He was dubbed the British Elvis, but to millions, he wasn't an imitation. He was the real thing. His early singles, like Living Doll and Travelin' Light, topped charts for weeks. Teenage girls screamed his name at airports and fainted at concerts. His clean image made him acceptable to parents. His charm made him irresistible to daughters. Cliff had become the country's first homegrown rock idol, the bridge between the stiff, grey post-war Britain and the colourful, swinging 60s that were about to come. But unlike many rock stars of his generation, Cliff carried something different inside him: restraint. While his peers dove headfirst into fame's chaos, drugs, alcohol, scandal, Cliff remained calm, polite, and famously modest. He didn't drink, he didn't party, and for a long time he didn't even date publicly. When asked about it in the 1964 interview, he smiled and said, "Fame is wonderful, but I still want to like the person I see in the mirror." That philosophy made him beloved, but also isolated. He watched as bands like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Kinks redefined British music. The spotlight began to shift. His brand of wholesome pop seemed old-fashioned compared to the wild energy of the new era. Still, Cliff adapted. He starred in films like The Young Ones and Summer Holiday, where he sang, danced, and cemented his image as the eternal optimist, the smiling boy next door who never aged. Through the 70s and 80s, his success continued. Devil Woman, We Don't Talk Anymore, Wired for Sound. Each comeback proved he could survive changing trends. Yet, every return to fame came with a cost. Endless scrutiny, relentless press, and whispers about his private life. Cliff never married, and the tabloids turned his privacy into a mystery. He once said, "When you don't give them an answer, they invent one." Behind the fame, the man who once sang about summer and sunshine began to feel the weight of loneliness. He was grateful for the fans, the awards, the success, but each time the curtain closed, he felt a little more detached from the world outside the stage. For decades, Cliff balanced two lives: the performer adored by millions, and the private soul quietly searching for something that applause could never give him. And slowly he began to realize fame might have given him everything, but it had also taken something he could never get back. Behind the polished smile and timeless voice, Cliff Richard carried a weight few could imagine. For decades, he was the embodiment of clean living and moral virtue. The pop star who never stumbled, the celebrity who never sinned. But living as a symbol of perfection is its own kind of prison. As the 1990s rolled in, Cliff's fame evolved. He was no longer the teen idol, but a national treasure. Still, the British tabloids refused to let him age peacefully. They chased him with cameras, questioned his private life, and speculated endlessly about his relationships, faith, and sexuality. Cliff, true to his character, refused to play their game. He didn't explain, he didn't fight back. He simply smiled and carried on. But the pressure grew heavier. In 2014, everything changed. Without warning, Cliff Richard's name was dragged into one of the most publicized investigations in British celebrity history. Police raided his home, while television crews filmed from helicopters overhead. He was accused of crimes he did not commit, crimes that would later prove false. But by then, the damage was done. He said later, "I felt like my life was being torn apart in front of millions. I'd always believed in justice, but for the first time, I doubted it. For nearly 4 years, Cliff lived under a shadow of suspicion. He wasn't charged, but the world's judgment was swift. Concerts were canceled, his reputation stained, and the press that once adored him now watched for signs of collapse. Even after being fully cleared, the scars remained. In a rare interview, he admitted that period broke something inside him. He said later, "I used to trust the world. Now I trust only a few." That was the beginning of his quiet withdrawal. Cliff began spending more time at his home in Portugal, away from the noise, the gossip, and the cruel theater of fame. He still sang, but only when he wanted to. He still smiled, but behind that smile was a man who had finally learned the price of visibility. His disappearance wasn't sudden. It was slow, deliberate. A man reclaiming his life inch by inch from a spotlight that had burned him for too long. In the quiet years that followed the storm, Cliff Richard began to rebuild, not his fame, but his peace. He no longer chased headlines or album sales. Instead, he focused on faith, family, and the few who had never doubted him. For the first time in 60 years, the man who had lived every moment under public gaze found solitude. He spent months at his home in Portugal, tending to his garden, swimming in the mornings, and reading scripture in the evenings. To outsiders, it looked like retirement. To Cliff, it was resurrection. He had survived something worse than obscurity. He had survived being forgotten and misunderstood by the world he had served. In interviews, his voice often trembled when he spoke about those years. "When I was alone," he said, "I realized I had to find the man behind the songs again. I had to find Harry." That return to Harry, his real self, became the heart of his rebirth. He began writing again, not songs for the charts, but hymns, reflections, personal letters turned into melodies. He released smaller albums, intimate and spiritual, far from the stadium anthems of his youth. Then came the confession that explained everything, the truth behind his disappearance. Cliff said he no longer wanted to live in a world ruled by gossip and greed. "I didn't vanish," he said quietly. "I walked away from noise." He spoke of betrayal by those he trusted, of nights lying awake wondering if kindness still existed. Yet, despite everything, he never lost faith, not in God, not in music, and not in the healing power of silence. There was tragedy in that revelation, not the kind that ends in death, but the kind that comes from realizing how fragile the soul becomes after decades of applause. He had spent a lifetime singing about love, joy, and hope, but in the end, the greatest song he ever wrote was the life he chose to live, one of humility, forgiveness, and quiet strength. When fans saw him again, older, slower, but smiling, they didn't see the pop star anymore. They saw the survivor. And perhaps that's what fame had taken from him all along, the right to simply be human.
Today, Sir Cliff Richard stands as one of the last true gentlemen of pop, a man who has seen the rise and fall of fame, yet refused to let it define him. He has sold more than 250 million records, performed in every decade since the 1950s, and remains the only British artist to have a #1 hit in 5 consecutive decades. But his greatest legacy isn't measured in charts or awards. It's found in the quiet grace with which he carried himself when the world turned its back. Cliff's story isn't about a man who disappeared. It's about a man who chose to be still, He once said, "When the lights go out, you discover who you really are. I used to live for the applause. Now I live for peace." To his fans, he'll always be the boy with the golden voice, the eternal summer smile. To himself, he's Harry, the man who finally found freedom in silence. And maybe that's the truth the world had missed all along, that sometimes the bravest thing a legend can do is to simply walk away.